organize this. It's nice to see that on a holiday. Actually, it is a holiday, even though most people won't recognize or realize that it is. It's nice to see that so many people have registered and joined me and all of us today to discuss a little bit about arbitration. So what we are going to do is over a period of 3 days, that is today, tomorrow, and day after. For a short while, say 40 minutes, 1 hour, we'll be discussing various facets of arbitration law and how it goes in practice as well. And today, how we have split it essentially is the commencement of arbitration, the process of the arbitral proceedings itself, and what happens after the award is passed. So also just let me know in the middle anytime in the chat it's if I'm going too fast or if I'm not audible. We will put it on the chat and then we'll try and address that. Okay, start the video, but we can't see you. So I won't actually, the thing is I won't be using my video because I'll be using certain documents to go through and explain to you certain concepts. Unless if there are any questions, you can always put it in the chat. We'll take it up towards the end. Okay. So having said that, I hope that everyone's now settled down and we can just start with the session. So in today's session, what I'm essentially going to deal with is everything starting from the drafting of the arbitration clause, right? I will be dealing only with the drafting of the arbitration clause, not the contract as a whole, obviously. And then we'll move on to checking after what happens when a dispute actually arises. What are the steps that are to be taken? The matters of interim relief and the issuance of a notice of arbitration, which formally commences the arbitral proceeding. And we'll also briefly touch upon the process of approaching a court to appoint an arbitrator. So what I would also suggest is that you just keep your arbitration acts handy. The Indian Arbitration Act. You can, of course, keep it on your laptop, on PDF or in paper, anyhow, whatever is convenient to you. So before I start with the first thing, I'd just like to share with you one thing. Now, about 2 years ago, actually, I was attending this session in person at the Bombay Bar Association in the High Court. That session was being taken by a senior advocate, Mr. Janak Dwarkadas. He was discussing and talking about the art of advocacy. One of the most important things that I could take out from that session is that a key trait for a lawyer is to develop foresight. Foresight, and foresight. Basically, what that means is that you have to be able to anticipate, right? You have to be able to anticipate that the kind of dispute that arises, what is the judge going to ask? What is the kind of situation that you are likely to face? Now, he was talking about foresight and anticipation in the context of preparing for a hearing before the court. Today, we are going to take one step back and we are going to see in the context of an arbitration proceeding. So the starting point for anyone to be able to develop foresight and where we will need it the most is when we make the arbitration clause itself. Because one would think that while drafting the arbitration clause, which many of you might have already seen, would be just about a paragraph or two paragraphs, a few lines in the contract. It has a secondary, it is couched as a little child in the big picture of the contract that it is. But even though it is such a small part of the contract, it plays a huge role, because when you're drafting the arbitration clause, you have to essentially be aware of the entire legal structure that governs an arbitration proceeding as well, right? Because if you draft an arbitration clause that is defective, your entire effort is going to go in vain. So let's start with drafting an arbitration clause. Now, I'll just request the organizers to put up the document which I have shared with them. Yeah. Great. So my apologies if there are any errors in the document, because it's been a bit of a rush and it's slightly rough as well. So what I'll be doing is we'll go through this document and we'll discuss each aspect, okay, of drafting an arbitration clause. Now, there are certain, the Arbitration Act in India provides for certain procedures that are mandatory and certain procedures that are, or laws that are directory. You may or may not choose to follow it, but certain things are mandatory. For example, it might sound obvious, but the arbitration clause has to be a written agreement, right? You can't have an oral arbitration agreement, even though otherwise under the Contract Act you may enter into agreements that are oral. They will still be contracts. They could still be enforceable by courts depending on evidence that you lead. But no matter what evidence you have, it doesn't matter. You have to have the arbitration agreement in writing. It can be an arbitration clause in the contract, or it can be a separate agreement. It can be incorporated by reference from a different contract, which means that in your contract which you are currently dealing with, you can say that the arbitration clause in the X contract will be imported over here, or you simply make a reference over there and say incorporated by reference. Sometimes it so happens that agreements are entered into by way of correspondence. I am a buyer sitting in India. There is a supplier in Australia, and we are corresponding. I say that I want so and so amount of such and such goods, and the other side says, okay, fine, I'll send it to you by so and so means. I say, fine, that's also cool. And during this process, one of the parties suggests that in case there is any dispute, we'll resolve it by arbitration. Right? There's no agreement as such, but there is, in the correspondence, there is a suggestion that the dispute should be resolved by arbitration. The other party either says, okay, we'll resolve it by arbitration, or says nothing else at all. So even that by itself, since it's in writing, will be an arbitration agreement pursuant to Section 7 of the Arbitration Act. Now, when I say unambiguous, it means that you have to clearly be able to show that parties have in fact already agreed that arbitration is the way they want to resolve it. Now, this agreement can be at the time of the contract, or it can also be after the dispute has arisen. So today, till the time the dispute arises, there is no agreement on arbitration. But then parties say, okay, fine. Now that we are at odds with each other, let's now resolve it by arbitration. Let's not go to the court. That's also fine. Now, for example, if the parties agree that when the dispute arises, parties will submit it to arbitration if they so agree. So this is an ambiguous clause. There is no clear agreement to arbitration. That means that when the dispute arises, that time again, the parties will be free to choose whether they want to go to arbitration or not, which means that one of the parties will say, no, I don't want to go to arbitration. So this kind of a clause in the contract will not be enforceable. I have provided the case law over here in the first one. Now, insofar as the second part concerns, and I also spoke about the form of agreement, you can have various forms, which we just discussed, it as an arbitration clause, a separate arbitration agreement, incorporation through a different contract, or exchange of correspondence. Now, one thing I would like to share with you is that very recently, the Supreme Court of India was dealing with a situation where the main contract in which there was an arbitration clause, that contract did not carry a stamp duty, did not carry the adequate stamp duty, or at all, whatever the case may be. Now, the law is clear that when an agreement is not stamped or insufficiently stamped, the court will not act on such an agreement in any manner, and such an agreement will not be taken into consideration as evidence in any proceedings. First, the agreement will have to be impounded by the stamping authorities. Once the party who wants to rely on the agreement, that party clears the stamp duty, then they can go on and act on the agreement. So the Supreme Court decided that when there is an arbitration clause inside such an agreement where the agreement is unstamped, you can't, or the court cannot act even on the arbitration clause because the main contract is not stamped. It is not that an arbitration clause otherwise or an arbitration agreement otherwise requires any stamp duty. It does not require stamp duty. But if it is in an agreement which is unstamped, it will not be acted upon. So while drafting an arbitration clause, one should make sure, if it is possible, that the stamp duty is already paid. If that is not possible, then that is something that will come up later. And one of the alternatives that parties can take to avoid this kind of a problem is to enter into a separate arbitration agreement, right? Because if you have the main contract and on a separate paper, say arbitration agreement where you say that disputes arising out of the main contract will be referred to arbitration, then the arbitration agreement is dissected from the main contract and no stamp duty will be payable on the arbitration agreement. Now, none of this is to say that stamp duty should not be paid. That's not the point. You must always pay stamp duty, because even if you have a separate agreement, the agreement may not be impounded, but maybe the arbitral reference also will be made, but the proceedings will not go on because the arbitrator is under the same obligations under statute to not proceed with an unstamped or insufficiently stamped document. Now, if we can scroll a little lower in this document. Yeah. So again, parties can choose, to either refer the entire dispute or any dispute, all disputes to arbitration, or only some of the matters under the contract to arbitration. Now, one would immediately think of decisions like Chloro Controls, right? Where Chloro Controls versus Severn Trent, it's a judgment of the Supreme Court, where the arbitration clause said that any and all disputes arising under or in connection with this agreement shall be referred to arbitration. What happens with this kind of a broad clause is that you say that literally any dispute that is relevant to this transaction, right? Even though it is not just under this agreement, but relating to or in connection with this agreement, all of these disputes will be referred to arbitration only, not to court proceedings. So that's one way of looking at it. It's a broad kind of arbitration. Sometimes parties will say that we don't want to refer all the disputes to arbitration, only some things. So, for example, which I have come across is in insurance contracts. Now, the insurance company, they say that if the insurance claim is otherwise admitted, yes, okay, your claim is admitted, but for the quantum, the amount that I should be paying out to the person who's insured, that will be decided by arbitration. So that means that if the insurance company does not agree to the claim, or the claim is not admitted, then the arbitration agreement does not exist, right? So when you're drafting an arbitration clause, it's your choice to see whether you want to refer all the disputes to arbitration or only some to arbitration. If you see subsequently in the Arbitration Act, an award can be challenged if the arbitrator goes beyond the scope of the dispute or scope of reference. Okay, now the judgment and its correctness is, personally, I don't agree with it, because whether there is an admission of liability or admission of the insurance claim liability is also a question that has to be determined, right? Which means that if you go to the court and the court then decides that yeah, it is actually admitted, or it is not capable of not being admitted, then it will have to be referred to arbitration. So it's like an anomalous situation. In any case, as the law stands today, you can agree to some provision like this. Okay, so let's just deal with the next one, which is basically asymmetrical arbitration clauses. Now, this is another curious kind of structure that parties sometimes agree to, especially in loan transactions or financing transactions, etc., where the parties agree, both the parties are agreeing that only one of the parties will choose whether, when the dispute arises, they would want to go for arbitration or they would want to go for litigation. Only one party can choose to decide this. So if I may just request you to scroll a little further below. Yeah, yeah. Now this provision, if as you might just see, there is no clear provision here in India as to what is the position. The Delhi High Court has previously held that no, this kind of a clause you can't enforce because there is no mutuality, right? Parties are not ad idem when the dispute arises. Only one party gets to decide if I go for arbitration or not, right? But the Calcutta High Court has said that there is nothing like that. They have specifically discussed the Delhi High Court judgment, and they said that see, both the parties have decided that one of the parties will choose. So then it's not like both the parties have not decided, right? But there can be certain issues of unconscionability, or that there is a lack of equality between the parties. As we'll also see when we scroll down below, that unilateral clauses generally, whether it is for appointment of arbitrator, whether it is for designation of seat, these kind of clauses are not going to be enforced by the court. Again, personally speaking, the correctness is questionable, as in it is debatable. I won't say questionable, it is at least debatable whether courts should interfere into these kind of things. Okay, but as of now, we are not sure whether asymmetrical clauses will be enforced in India, right? Then we come on to a concept of multi-tiered or escalation clauses. The first thing in arbitration, what we think is, fine, we have agreed to arbitration, let's just go for it now, enough, once there's a dispute. But sometimes transactions are complex, obligations are very crucial, like in infrastructure contracts, for example. If just, yeah, thanks. In infrastructure contracts, for example, when parties are performing their transactions, if one of the parties stops building a bridge or building the metro, that is going to cause a lot of havoc and inconvenience to a lot of people, including the government, the exchequer, so on and so forth. So instead of completely stopping the dispute, right, you use an escalation method. First thing, which is very common even in non-infrastructure contracts, is for parties to attempt a negotiation before making the formal reference to arbitration, right? So you can say perhaps that parties will agree that for 30 days or 60 days, they'll try and attempt negotiation before they refer the dispute to arbitration, right? Then there are, as I said, in infrastructure contracts, there are various layers, right? They will say that if the contractor has a dispute, if the contractor has any problem, then you first approach an officer of the employer. The employer is mostly the government. So any officer, the engineer or head engineer, so on and so forth, and ask her for her opinion or her decision. Then if you're unhappy, then you go on to the next phase. Apply to the senior officer. If you are not happy with that her decision as well, then you resolve. Then you write to the chief managing director or chairman and managing director of the entity in question, for example, say MADA, and then you express your intention that now I want to refer the dispute to arbitration, enough is enough. And then you can go to arbitration. You have to spend this much time trying to settle the dispute, and then you go to arbitration. Now, again, the thing is, this kind of a clause, it's permissible. There's nothing wrong with having such a clause. But whether something like this can be enforced is also still questionable. There have been various judgments in India where high courts have said, yes, you can't just go to section 11 and bother the court. First, you have to finish your procedures that you have only agreed to under the contract, right? So what I have said over here, it would be really interesting if you check this article that this one Mr. Saurabh Bindal and Gunjal Chhabra, they have written. That's quite interesting, so that you can check later on. But in reality, what happens is these kind of situations also, whether it's a negotiation clause or whether it's an escalation clause, when a party is actually aggrieved, whether it's a contractor or it's any other party to the agreement, you don't want to wait. You can't wait because you have reached a certain point in your legal relationship that the differences have become completely irreconcilable. So there's no point for you to go and try negotiating or trying to use the escalation mechanism. So in such circumstances, whether you can completely ignore these contractual mechanisms, I'm not sure. But especially if you are going to be at some kind of harm or prejudice, which means that if you wait for the negotiation, or if you have to wait for the escalation, if prices are going to increase, if your rights are going to get diluted, then I would try to argue that these things are not enforceable, mainly because they are vague. As far as the negotiation clause is concerned, it is vague, because how am I going to show that parties have actually attempted any negotiation? What is the meaning of attempting negotiation? There are judgments in the UK which are to this time that you can't prove, what whether parties have tried to negotiate or not. As far as the escalation is concerned, some courts have said that when the procedure is not adjudicatory, which means that it does not follow the general principles of law otherwise. So when I'm going to an engineer or any other such officer, you may not have the right of representation, of legal representation. You may not have the right of being heard entirely. That engineer may not be trained in the law. Many other things are possible. So it can be argued, according to me, that this is not an adjudicatory mechanism. So you have to forego it, forget about it, right? Now, let's go to the next one.
Shreyash, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I am involved in a lot of projects in finance, sort of drafting these contracts as well, negotiations. So just had this question in mind that, so for example, we do draft a lot of these multi-tiered arbitration clauses wherein the parties are supposed to negotiate first.
Right.
And, we also typically avoid these sort of multi-tiered arbitration clauses because we understand that enforceability becomes a question later
That's
on.
right.
So in those circumstances, from a practical point of view, since you guys are involved in the disputes phase, do you guys see that judges do, for example, if someone was to go under a Section 9 or Section 11 petition to the court, do judges do refer the parties to negotiation under some mechanism, or let's say mediation, because of the fact that, for example, Delhi courts have heard that they do refer certain parties on certain commercial matters nowadays to mediation. I don't know to what extent that is right now being done, but given the fact that that's pretty much a scenario, are the Bombay courts doing that, or what is the practical scenario on this? If you can just throw some light on this.
So this is a great question, actually, and unfortunately there is no straight answer. But what I will tell you personally, what I feel is this: that the court under Section 11 would ideally not go into the question of whether parties have actually attempted settlement, and clearly on a reading Section 11, court really doesn't have the power to refer you to mandate you to go and mediate or negotiate. Okay, so that is one thing.
Correct.
If you see, there is a judgment called Konkan Railways of the Supreme Court,
right,
in 2000 or 2002, where the court had,
I think
one of those years. So the Supreme Court has actually held that we don't have to go into this kind of a question. But then Konkan Railways was on a different point, or rather, related point, overruled by SBP Patel Engineering. And today we are in a situation where Patel Engineering also is kind of legislatively overruled because of Section 11(6)(a), which says that the court will not go into anything other than the existence of the arbitration agreement before referring the matter to arbitration. So, and then now we're actually in a situation where 11(6)(a) has been deleted. So,
correct. I mean to say it's a repeal provision, right?
Yeah. So it has been omitted.
11(6)(a) is
But
Yeah.
Justice Nariman
Yeah.
has clarified in a
Okay.
judgment. I'll share it with you later. That deletion of 11.6a
Yeah.
does not mean that the court will now be able to go into everything that they used to before. So to put shortly to answer your
Oh.
question, under 11, I do not think that the court will go into the question or mandate you to negotiate. And under section 9 also,
Okay.
where if there technically even existence is not checked, even though it should be, and courts have said that we have to first check if the arbitration agreement exists. But it would be very far-fetched for courts to then tell you under section 9 to go and negotiate and mediate, because to go under section 9 for urgent relief or temporary relief just on the basis of existence of the arbitration agreement. So
Okay.
even assuming that you have to be referred to mediation or negotiation, if there is an urgent relief that is required, then the court should be able to grant it, and then you can choose to go to negotiation or then commence arbitration. But that being said, if an interim relief is granted under section 9, then you have to
Right.
commence the arbitration within 90 days.
Okay.
Otherwise, it will either get vacated, or the other side will have to apply for vacating the interim order. So this is the conspectus essentially. But again, unfortunately, there is no clear answer to this question. This is what my view is.
Okay.
Right?
Got it. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shreyash, this is Palak here.
Hello, Palak. If I may just interrupt you, sorry for that. Hi, Ritvik. I want to make an announcement. Hi, Ritvik. The session would end in 5 minutes. So if we can just take 5 minutes break, and then we'll be back again for 40 minutes. I hope that's fine.
Okay. So we'll just do that. Just 1 minute. What I will just request, or rather ask everyone, see how it's going to happen, as he just pointed out, is in 5 minutes this one will be done, and we'll go on to another session. Now, I'm looking at another 40-45 minutes. I hope that is okay with you all, because we'll be covering a few aspects here.
Yeah. I mean to say that's perfectly fine with a lot of people I know.
Okay, fine. So that's good. Fine. So we'll catch up after the break.
Yeah, sure.
Far as such an objection is not permissible in law, or permissible, or insofar as the law provides. So if the law provides that you have the right to object, then it doesn't matter that you agree. But if the law somewhere allows for an objection, then you can exclude that. So in such kind of a dispute, you may have an arbitration clause which provides that no objections on arbitrability can be raised insofar as security deposit is concerned. So later on, this issue should not be taken, right?
So Shreyas, I have just one question on that. What would happen that in case of the parties do decide that they will not arbitrate on such a dispute, or on questions which are per se not arbitrable, right? That's the correct word to use.
They will, if they decide that they will not arbitrate on something, then the dispute will definitely not be referred to arbitration.
Correct. But on certain issues which are arbitrable, which are not arbitrable, there will not be any objection to, is what you are contending, right?
Yeah, if the law,
to put it as a drafting point.
Yes, if the law says that a dispute is just not arbitrable, then it doesn't matter what you agree, technically, right? So it doesn't matter.
On the objection point, can you clarify that
so
again?
This is actually a suggestion that I am trying to put. It has not actually been tested by the court, to my knowledge.
Right.
That if the parties agree beforehand only that in a leave and license agreement, that they will not raise a dispute on the grounds of arbitrability insofar as security deposit is concerned. Then when the dispute actually arises, and the dispute is only about security deposit, or at least insofar as it is related to the security deposit, no party should be able to either file a section 16 application before the tribunal, or in a section 11 application make an argument that the arbitration should not be made, or there should be no appointment of arbitrator because the dispute is not arbitrable. This is what I'm trying to kind of say, that this is a possibility, which it will have to be tested by
Correct.
the courts. So
Correct. And of course, I mean to say the obvious objection to that sort of a clause would be this, that nevertheless parties would intend to, anyways go to the court, and then again probably just raise a dispute on the point whether it can be arbitrated or not.
yeah,
So,
but then the court will see, right? The court will see that you have already agreed, so they'll throw it out. And if the case is completely frivolous, they might impose costs also, which is rare.
yeah,
But it is
but then are there questions like excluding the jurisdiction of the court or an arbitral tribunal, and those sort of questions might again just somewhere delay the entire thing. That's what I think of, but I still anyways hinge upon what you say.
right. No,
I would say I was just trying to portray.
I understand the predicament that you're trying to pose, but see, at the end of the day, no matter what you agree, nobody can stop anyone
Correct.
from actually approaching the court, even where
Correct.
there is an exclusive jurisdiction clause, or you parties can always go to the completely wrong jurisdiction just to be told that you are at the wrong jurisdiction. But you can't stop people.
Yeah, or just as a delaying tactic or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So I hope that answers, or at least throw some light on the question. Now, just one suggestion, if I may, and what the organizers have also asked me is if we can just keep the questions at the end. Okay, we'll do a question answer session, right? Okay. Now, so moving on, one of the most important things of course is the governing law of the contract, right? So this technically it may also not be a part of the arbitration clause. It may be just a part of the agreement as a whole, but it makes a difference. So if you can just scroll down a little bit below and capture the entire box. Now, the governing law of the contract essentially means what is the substantial law that will be governing the parties' relationship and other appurtenant or surrounding facts, right? Which, for example, if the parties are both Indian, okay, then it has to mandatorily be governed by Indian law only in a domestic arbitration. So what is the substantive law that I'm talking about? Which is basically the Indian Contract Act, the Specific Relief Act of India, the Companies Act in India, so on and so forth. Okay, so these are things that if you are two Indian parties, then you have to submit to Indian law only. Two Indian parties cannot agree that we will resolve our disputes in accordance with Swiss law, because that would be against the public policy of India. Now there is in TDM infrastructure, I have not put this judgment over here, but I just remembered that in TDM infrastructure, this is a 2001 or 2011 judgment of the Supreme Court, where it has been said that two Indian parties cannot be permitted to derogate from Indian substantive law. So in case you want to refer, that is a judgment that you can take a look at. But where there is an where there is an international arbitration, which means in a transaction where one of the parties is Indian and one or more parties on the opposite side is not Indian in the way that is provided in the Arbitration Act, then parties can choose whichever system of law that they want to resolve their disputes by. For example, in many transactions, shipping transactions, the parties will choose a neutral governing law of the contract. They will choose a neutral law of arbitration also. So many times parties will choose English law or laws of Singapore or laws of Switzerland, so on and so forth. These which will govern the actual substance of the contract, not the arbitration, right? The substance of the contract. So for example, what is the meaning of fraud, or whether, because fraud under Indian law and fraud under Singapore or English law would be different, maybe different. We don't know, right? So that is one thing. Then there are certain additional things that you can also agree to. For example, in an international sale of goods transaction, parties can agree that CISG, the Convention on international sale of goods will apply, right? So then in such cases, the tribunal or the court, where the court will in probably in 34, but in the tribunal will have to apply these laws and not Indian laws, even if the arbitration is actually seated in India, right? Sometimes the parties don't choose a governing law, which is not recommended. You should always choose your governing law, but sometimes it happens that they have not. So then the courts will see what is the intention of the parties, right? And if there is nothing to describe the intention of the parties, then the court will assess based on the nature of the transaction, the location of the transaction, where the transaction has to which jurisdiction this transaction has its closest and most real connection. Okay, so these are subjective things, but you will be able to show that no, my transaction has the closest connection to this particular place. So the governing law, even though we have not agreed, the governing law will be the law of this particular country or this particular state, right? That was decided in NTPC versus Singh. So if we scroll down below and go to the next. Now, okay, so this is the crown jewel of all problems in arbitration, I would say, perhaps, which is the seat of arbitration. Now, the thing is, as we discussed, there is a governing law of the contract, okay, so which parties can agree. But an arbitration proceeding or arbitration by itself is a different creature, okay. It's a different kind of a process. Your contract is a part of it, but how are the parties supposed to behave? How is the tribunal supposed to act? In what manner is it supposed to act? How is the award supposed to be made? If the award is not acceptable, how and before which court is it supposed to be challenged? On what grounds can it be set aside? These things are not a part of the substantive law of the contract. They are a part of what we would call perhaps curial law, right? So it is very important that you choose the seat of arbitration, or what we call the place of arbitration. Once the parties, if the parties have agreed to a particular seat, then the laws of that geographical jurisdiction, basically that country, the arbitration act or statute of that country will apply to the arbitration procedure, right? Now, there have been various issues that arise because of this, because sometimes parties say that the arbitration will be in a particular place, and then they say that the venue will be a different place, or they apply a different kind of rules of arbitration, so on and so forth. So these kind of issues happen. So what would be ideal is for parties to be very clear about where they want to seat the arbitration. Now, this can differ in domestic and international arbitration. In domestic arbitration, frankly speaking, if you think about it, the only one law of arbitration that can apply is the Indian Arbitration Act. Okay, so within India, there can only be one seat. The seat is India. So when it's a domestic arbitration, it is perhaps arguable that the only thing you can actually choose is the venue. Now, when parties choose a particular venue, it could be Mumbai, it could be Delhi, it could be anything. Recently, what had happened was the parties had chosen to resolve their disputes by arbitration, which would be seated either in Delhi or in Faridabad. So this kind of a confusion, I won't go too deep into it, but what the Supreme Court eventually decided was that if there is an express designation of a venue, forget the nomenclature. What if you call it a venue, you call it a place, whatever it is. If you designate any particular place, and in the contract or in the arbitration clause, there is nothing else to say that there is a different seat of arbitration, or you are silent on the seat of arbitration, but venue is there, then it will be considered that the venue that you have designated is the seat of arbitration. All right, that will be the seat of arbitration. And what that means is, once that is decided that that is the seat of arbitration, then the courts of that, the courts which are located in that particular area will have exclusive jurisdiction over the proceeding. So if I choose Mumbai as the seat of arbitration, or if I choose Mumbai as the venue of arbitration, but I don't say anything about any seat, okay, then the courts in Mumbai will have exclusive jurisdiction. It would not then matter where the cause of action has arisen, or where the parties reside, or where the transaction has failed, or any of these. Now, another important thing is, again, we'll also see later on unilateral rights, etc., that there is a judgment in by the Bombay High Court, very recent judgment of the Bombay High Court. The clause said that one of the seat of arbitration will be Mumbai or any other place chosen by one of the parties at their sole discretion. So the court said, see boss, you can't have this kind of a clause where there's one place or there is any other place that only one of the parties will decide. Such kind of a clause, or at least that part of the clause, will not be enforceable. So then place A will be treated as a seat of arbitration. Okay, there in fact you can have a 2-3 sessions on seat of arbitration only. But anyway, now for now we'll just move on to the next one. So just the venue. If you can just go a little bit up. So we have frankly we have also discussed venue, because venue, if you think about it, when there are two different things, when the seat is also there and when the venue is also there, right? Remember, venue as a term, or even seat, if I am not wrong, is not even used in the Arbitration Act, Indian Arbitration Act. What the word that is used is place. That is probably what has created confusion. The Law Commission has on time and again recommended that you make it clear that place is seat and venue is different. Okay, but anyway, for now as it is, seat and venue, when they are together, when they are juxtaposed together like this, and both are told, then seat will be the one which has its governing law of the arbitration, right? And venue is probably the physical place, the geographical location where you are actually going to sit and do the arbitration. That is the convenient venue. Sometimes what happens is parties choose a venue. Okay, let's say the arbitration will be conducted in Mumbai. Okay, and it will be administered in accordance with the LCIA rules, which is the London Court of International Arbitration. Now, London Court of International Arbitration is headquartered in London, obviously. There used to be an India office of LCIA. Okay, they used to be here, but now it's not there. So there, people will think, now what are we supposed to do? It says Mumbai, but accordance with LCIA. So are we supposed to go to London, and how does this work? So what I would say, if you look at Roger Shashwa, it says venue, it's not seat. Okay, in this kind of a contract. So first of all, we have to treat the venue as the seat, which means that the law of arbitration will be enforced. And in India, even though LCI doesn't have physical presence, it has the power or has the wherewithal also to administer the arbitration in India. So that is workable. But in such a situation, the seat will be India and LCI will be government. Sorry, which one? Just a second, I'll just check my arbitration act. Can we just put up the arbitration act once on the screen? So as insofar as, so what 22 says is that failing any agreement referred to in subsection 1, which means subsection 1 says that parties are free to agree on any place for the arbitration. If parties don't agree to anything like this, then the place of arbitration shall be determined by the tribunal having regard to the circumstances of the case, including convenience of the parties. Now, that's what I'm saying. This this, according to me, is not the venue. This is the seat only. If the parties don't choose a seat, then the tribunal will choose the seat. The tribunal will have to determine where is the seat of arbitration. This is according to me. Now we'll have to. It's a disputed question. Now 23. If you look at 23, what it says is where meet at any place it considers appropriate. This is the tribunal that will decide for meeting purposes. That is the venue, and the venue can keep shifting also. That's the thing. Today you can meet in Mumbai, tomorrow you can meet in Delhi. So when you're designating a geographical location in the arbitration clause, I would always recommend that you would designate it keeping in mind that this is going to be the seat of arbitration. Seat of arbitration, right? So anyway, if we can move to the next part, the law governing the substance. Can we scroll down below, please, on the sheet? Yeah, on the other screen also. Thank you. So a few more things, okay? Now, the law, no, I think if we can just go a little bit above. On point number 10. Yeah, thank you. So this is what we spoke about right now is the same, essentially the same thing, which arises, okay, once you designate the consequences. So the law governing the substance of the arbitration will essentially be tied to the seat of arbitration, right? And if you seat the arbitration in India, okay, if both the parties say that arbitration will happen in Mumbai, then India will, the part 1 of the Arbitration Act will definitely apply. Okay, it has to apply if the arbitration is in India, whether it is an international arbitration or a domestic arbitration or two foreign parties arbitrating in India, part 1 will apply. That is the curial law of the arbitration, the questions that we just considered about. Okay, if the arbitration is seated outside India, then part 1 of the Arbitration Act will not apply, except for provisions of interim relief and taking evidence under section 27, and then the appeal provisions in section 37, which we'll see below again later. Okay, so and if you want to, you can check out the judgment in Anacon versus Anacon, where there's a complete jumble of designations, and it's a completely unworkable arbitration clause, so to say, but it was still enforced by the court. So how is that dealt with is something that you can check in this judgment. Okay, so next we can let's take a look at the next. Okay, so for now, what we have looked at is the governing law of the contract. So Indian Contract Act, for example, the arbitration proceedings, the real law, the supervisory law we have looked at, grounds for challenge, interim relief, so on and so forth from the courts, that we have looked at. That is a curial law. Now we will look at also the law that governs the proceedings, the arbitral process, the conduct of the arbitral proceedings. Okay, so parties can agree to that also. If it's so there can be two things which we also see below. It can be either an institutional arbitration or it can be an ad hoc arbitration. We'll see what that means just in a bit. But where we agree to an institutional arbitration, parties can say that the arbitration will be governed or administered. It will be administered in accordance with the LCIA rules, or with the SIAC rules, or with the MCIA rules. Right? LCIA is London Court of International Arbitration, SIAC is Singapore International Arbitration Center, and MCIA is the Mumbai Court of International Arbitration, Mumbai Center for International Arbitration. All of them have their own rules. Okay, so the arbitral tribunal will have to conduct itself, or the parties also will have to conduct themselves in accordance with these rules of arbitration. In addition to the Arbitration Act and in addition to the governing law. Okay. Now, even if you agree to any arbitral rules, there are certain mandatory provisions in India which will apply, of course, if the seat is India. For example, Section 18 of the Arbitration Act, which says that parties have to be treated equally at all times, right? So it doesn't matter what your rules say. If this is violated, then it may be so that the award may be set aside. Okay, so just to point it out to you. All right. And one thing that I would say is that this is, of course, again, this is optional, but you should always make sure that your rules of arbitration are consistent with the institution that you have chosen. This it might seem so obvious, but it happens. Sometimes the arbitration clause is to be administered by SEAC, which is in Singapore, in accordance with the MCI rules, which honestly it doesn't make sense. SEAC in accordance with LCI rules, SEAC in accordance with ICC rules, so on and so forth. So when you're drafting the arbitration clause, try and keep it consistent with the institution, with the rules and the institution, as also with the seat and venue of the arbitration. Okay. Now, insofar as you also have a choice whether you are going to conduct your arbitration using help from an institution, arbitral institution, or you will do it by yourself, which basically means an ad hoc arbitration. Now, when I say by yourself, it means that the tribunal will decide. Okay. Then, and as we will also see tomorrow, when arbitration proceedings commence in an ad hoc arbitration, one of the first things that will happen is that there will be a procedural order. How is the matter supposed to go? So in an ad hoc arbitration, the tribunal will itself decide how the arbitration is be administered, what are the rules that we are supposed to follow, what are the timelines we are supposed to follow, what are the methods, so on and so forth. These kind of things will be decided by the tribunal itself. In an institutional arbitration, the institution will, of course, the institution will decide. How will they decide? In accordance with the rules of arbitration. Okay. So, couple of benefits that you get from an institutional arbitration is that they are, of course, they are much more organized. Their whole purpose is to just govern an arbitration and make sure that everything is all right. They have people, they have case managers, they have counsel who will help. They have other contacts with other services like transcription services, so on and so forth, from which they can help. They can provide you space for holding your arbitration meetings. They will assist you in appointing the arbitrator, so on and so forth. If there are any other applications, most institutions have a court. They have a court of themselves, by which I mean they have a panel of people where they make certain decisions. For example, if an arbitrator is to be appointed, then the court will decide whether this person has, crossed all requirements. Even though you are, of course, entitled to nominate the arbitrator. So the question is, between ad hoc and institutional arbitration, what should be chosen? Honestly, that really depends on the kind of dispute that you have, and it depends really a lot on the amount that is claimed in the dispute. If the amount is small, depending on what you consider as small or big, then if in a small amount you should go for an ad hoc arbitration. It's not that bad. But if it's a greater amount, it's a huge amount, say some 20, 100 crores or 500 crores, then it's always better to have an institutional arbitration because everything is systematic. Okay. Now, a few other things like the number of arbitrators. You don't have to say how many number of arbitrators you want to choose, but it is always better to clear these kind of things. So it can be any number, but it can't be an even number for obvious reasons. Most times it is 1 or 3 arbitrators. If you don't agree to any number, then law will presume that you wanted a sole arbitrator. Okay. So now we'll go to the qualifications. If you can just scroll a little bit down below. So I'll just quickly wrap up on these because I think we have some 7 minutes left. So now this also another thing that it's again optional. Parties are free to agree that their arbitrators must have possess certain qualifications because, and you'll think why, but for example, in infrastructure disputes or any particular kind of disputes, you would want specialists over there, not just lawyers. Okay, and you may want that one of the arbitrators has to be an engineer. Okay, so that person knows what is the technical aspect of the dispute, right? And that person will be hands-on while deciding the case. So there's something like this is permissible. It's fine, but it's I would say it is avoidable. I'll tell you why. Because firstly, if you see the last update in the 2019 amendments, there is a complete new schedule for providing the qualification. Okay, So that they are quite restrictive. They are tough qualifications. And when you appoint an engineer, that engineer has to be compliant with that particular provision in the 8th schedule, right? Same thing with a lawyer, by the way. Now, is if you appoint a lawyer or a judge, any other person, that person has to have 10 years of experience, as in accordance with the Advocates Act, and has to be an advocate under the meaning of the Advocates Act. Another reason why you really should, there's no need as such to have a qualification is one, once you make that qualification, when the dispute arises, it may be difficult for you to find such a person. Okay. And secondly, you can always, in the course of an arbitration, if you need someone to be an expert at something, then you can call for expert evidence. So that person will be able to assist the tribunal. That's what happens in real life also, in courts as well, right? So we can go down. Take the next. Can we move on to the next one, please? Okay, so this is very highly important, the manner of appointing arbitrators. Now, the Arbitration Act says that parties, they are free to choose the manner in which they appoint the arbitrator. Right? So they can say that only one arbitrator which both the parties agree. If both the parties don't agree, then each of them will provide a nomination, and then those two people who have been nominated will appoint the third arbitrator. Or it might say that one of the parties is allowed to choose from a pool of several arbitrators, 3 or 5, whatever the case may be. All right. The problem is that here you cannot have a right for one of the parties, okay, just for one of the parties to appoint the arbitrator, or even for just one of the parties to choose a person who appoints the arbitrator. Okay, because that kind of clause is not going to be enforced. This is what was held by the Supreme Court very recently in Perkins Eastman, and before that in TRF versus Energo. So let's just go a little bit later down below. I think we are coming to a close of the session, but I'll quickly go through these things. Now, basically, you are, of course, you also have the right to choose if any of the courts will have exclusive jurisdiction, even though they otherwise do not have. So one of the parties is in Delhi, the other would be in Chennai. The transaction has nothing to do with Mumbai. But if the parties agree, then they can agree that the exclusive jurisdiction will be with Mumbai courts, then the dispute will have to be submitted to Mumbai courts only. And of course, this will again be subject to the decision in SOMA, BJS SOMA, which we saw above, which said that once you designate a seat, that court will have the jurisdiction. And then all your applications, section 9, section 11, everything will have to be made over there only. You can't go to other places. So this is problematic, and okay, maybe it's a discussion for another day. But yeah, that's how it is. Insofar as injunctive reliefs are concerned, as we discussed above, that parties are free this is mainly in an international arbitration. Okay, so or rather arbitrations that are not seated in India, seated outside India, but there is an Indian party. Okay, so the law says that in case you want to exclude section 9, so you have to do it expressly. Okay, otherwise section 9, 27, 37 and parts thereof will continue to apply even if you are outside India. Why should this apply at all? I'll tell you why. Because when there is an Indian party, that Indian party will have some assets in India. So think of it, if you have a foreign client who is entering into a contract with an Indian party, if you don't have section 9, right, it will be very difficult for you, say you're an English company, to then apply before the London court and then get that judgment for freezing orders or injunction or whatever else it is, and then come to India, then enforce that judgment against that person. Okay, so that's not fair. So that's why after a big tussle between the Supreme Court's judgments in Bhatia and Balco, right, they have come up with, the law has come up with this kind of a leeway, or rather circumvention, I would say, to provide that section 9 will apply unless you exclude it. Now, what happens is, sometimes parties agree that parties argue that even though they have not expressly removed applicability of section 9, so on and so forth, because you agreed to the select rules, that means that, oh no, so that means you didn't want to apply any Indian part of the law as. But this question came up before the Delhi High Court, and they said that just because you refer to SIAC rules or anything like that doesn't mean by itself that you have excluded Section 9. Okay. In fact, if you see most of the rules, most of the institutional rules provide that nothing over here, nothing in these rules will prevent a party to seek injunctive relief from courts which otherwise have jurisdiction. All right. Now, the last thing in this segment is the soft laws. Now, this mostly people don't agree, which is also fine. But and this is what is taken up in the arbitral proceedings itself, because there could be matters of evidence. Okay, this is all outside anything that we have already discussed. So, how is the evidence to be taken? Right. One of the ways that can be done is to use the IBA rules on taking evidence. So parties can agree to that also in the agreement. It is not necessary, but it works, meaning depending on the kind of dispute that you have, it will help. Okay, so now this session is closing. It's less than 1 minute, I think. So you see if we can do another one, or how it's going to go. If the participants want, I'll continue, or we can take it up tomorrow, however. So this one is going to end. What I would suggest is that you guys come back in the next one and then let me know. Then we'll take it forward if you want to take it ahead. Because what I will be briefly discussing the notice of arbitration, etc. Wouldn't take much long.